Good afternoon. Good morning to everybody. I hope you all have your Zoom on quiet. We have with us Rabbi Irena Grutskevskaya, who is the executive director of Neve Shechter and Midreshet Shechter and Midreshet Shechter in Ukraine. We'd like to hear just 2 minutes from her before Professor Greenstein takes us into the book of Job. Bevakasha, Rav Irena.
Hello, it's great to see you all, people I know and people I wish to know. In Ukraine, we have four communities that we actually operate together with Mosorti Olami in Kharkiv, Kiev, Odessa, and Chernovitz. I go from time to time in between Tel Aviv and Ukraine. Uh, we have a lot of things going on throughout the year, but the highlight, and actually I'm going there next week. I'm starting my way to Ukraine for the Camp Ramah. It's actually one of the biggest camps, Jewish camps in Ukraine. We have 165 kids, and that's the maximum capacity of the safe space that we could find for the whole 2 weeks. And it's amazing for me to see those kids that grew up in camps. Most of our madrichim, they are former campers. And for me, it's like my family there that from time to time I meet in difficult times. I've understood that you are studying a book of Job there. So that's actually a book I'm referencing a lot in the past 4 years. I think sometimes the destinies in Ukraine are really, really amazing, and a lot of dilemmas that we can see in this wonderful book. I really witness them in human lives and human decisions. So really great to meet you all. Just my 2 minutes are up. I'm
Thank you.
really due to the task.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Irina. That
But
that
if
was the
someone
word for.
really wants to know more than 2 minutes, I'm always available. And any advice to whatever I'm doing is always great to hear.
Thank you. That was the word from a sponsor and worthy one. And we will now get to our class for today. This is the fourth session, where we'll be looking primarily at the deities' speeches from the whirlwind and Job's responses to them, and we'll try to imagine what Job's outlook on the world would be if we were to take into consideration both, what Job expected and what Job heard, right? And which is not necessarily the same as what we expect and what we hear. Now, there was a question that somebody had, and I'm not sure if I answered it before. I think I did, but we'll come back to it anyway, about why the wicked is represented by the lion, and that will come up in our discussion tonight. And so I'm going to not answer that right now, but I'm going to dig into that a little bit later on. I'm also going to try to leave a little time at the end, a little more than usual, so that if people have comments or questions, they can be raised, because we're not going to have, another class during which we can do that. On the other hand, I might mention that it's my understanding that if it hasn't happened already, these sessions are going to be put up on YouTube. So if you know people who were interested or would be interested, they can act. They will be able to, if they can't yet, access these sessions on YouTube. I imagine that you'll figure out how to do that. Okay. Now, what did Job expect? So we at the very beginning, we saw that Job was expecting God to be just. And expecting God to be just means that you have a belief in a deity who runs a world according to principles of justice. Now, I know there are some people who will say, well, God's justice and our justice are not really the same thing. I find that kind of argument meaningless because if we don't know what justice is, then we can't talk about it about God, and we can't talk about it in regard to humans. I mean, it's justice. There are certain principles that we associate with justice. Do we associate those principles with God, or we don't associate those principles with God? Now, here's the thing. Job, of course, expects God to be just, but he's extremely distressed, right, as you will recall, because um, he doesn't find God to be just. And not only that, his expectation is that God is going to continue to be unjust to him, so much so that he will incriminate him. That is, God will incriminate Job, even if Job is completely innocent. So I will call your attention to what he says in chapter 9, um, starting with chapter 9, verse 12. It's on page 40 in my annotated translation. He, that is God, can snatch, and who can restrain him? Who will say to him, what are you doing? In other words, there are no um, checks and balances on the deity. Since Eloah will not restrain his anger, even the soldiers of Rahab, who is the one of the names of the primeval sea monster that God did combat with before creating the world, an arch enemy, primeval enemy, even the soldiers of Rahab cower beneath him. How could I call him to account, choose my charges against him? I am powerless against God if I want to call him to account. Even in the right, I would get no response, even if I implored my opponent in court. And as you know, when we discussed Job's lawsuit against God, we know that he tries to sue God. And then we'll see how God tosses the case out. Even in the right, I would get no response, even if I implored my opponent in court. But I would summon and he would respond. But if I would summon and he would respond, I do not trust he would hear my complaint. So he's going, one after the other. That is, he's saying, well, I don't think God would respond. But if God were to respond, right, God wouldn't give me a fair hearing. He would push me on the hairline, which I explain as reject my case, and multiply my wounds for no cause. He would not let me return breath, for he saturates me with poison. If it's a matter of strength, then he is the strong. And if a legal proceeding, who can convene us, right? There's no third party judge who can compel God to appear in court. Even if were I in the right, his mouth would condemn me. Even were I innocent, he would wrong me. I am innocent. I care not for myself. I'm fed up with my life. But it's all the same. Job is not just distressed about what's happening to him. He's distressed about the fact that he believes that the world is governed in an unfair way. It is all the same. And so I declare the innocent and the guilty he brings to the same end, which is, the statement by Job that most irritates the rabbis in the Talmud. I'll just remind you of this fantastic um, metaphor that he uses in chapter 9, starting with verse 29, which gives the background on page 42 toward the bottom in my translation. I will be found guilty, so why should I strive in vain? Were I to wash myself with soap plant and cleanse my palms with lye, right, do a real scrub job, you would plunge me into the pit, so even my clothing would abhor me. You'll remember that this metaphor means God would make me look guilty. God can't turn me into someone who's guilty, but God can make me appear to the entire world as guilty. Verse 33. If It's on page 43 toward the middle. If only there were between us a prosecutor who would lay his hand on us both, who would remove his, God's, rod from upon me, so his awe would not terrify me, then could I speak and not fear him, for I am not being right toward myself. Right? Job is committed, as you know, to truth. Right? Uh, when some people say that when Job complains about or maintains the fact that he is completely innocent, some people think, well, he's being a little arrogant, isn't he? I would say no, he's not being arrogant. He's being honest, right? If he came home with 100 on his test, he's got to say when he's asked, "What grade did you get?" "I got 100," and it's not bragging; it's the truth. And so that's the truth of Job's. He must say what he believes to be true. He's committed to that. He's fanatical about that, we can even say. And in my judgment, the most radical thing and most basic thing about the theme of the book of Job is that it is about the priority of truth over all other values. There isn't anything else in the ancient Near East that I know of that's like it. But we will be looking at an ancient Near Eastern text later today so that you won't be disappointed. Okay, now, when Job makes his final speech, you'll remember that his final speech in chapters 29 through 31 includes his oath of innocence, where in order to compel God to appear, he swears up and down, I didn't do this, I didn't do that, I didn't do any of the types of things that would warrant my being afflicted as a punishment. Now, we know he's not being afflicted as a punishment, but he doesn't know that, and his friends don't know that. And I'm sorry to say that there are some readers of the book of Job who also don't catch that. In any case, what Job does is to take an oath that he could not have done any of the things that God could be holding against him. Therefore, the only way that God can justify God's self is to appear in court and to explain what the charges are against Job. That's Job's way of getting God to appear. Now, before he ends this speech, toward the end of chapter 31, Job says the following thing. At the bottom of, well, let's look at the bottom of page 132, starting with verse 35. If only I had a hearing judge, someone who could hear the case between us. Here is my mark. Let Shaddai respond, and let my rival write his indictment. I swear I would carry it on my shoulder. I wouldn't be ashamed if there really are good charges against me. He's very honest. I would wear it like a crown. I would declare the number of my steps. In other words, I would confess everything I've done. And like a prince, would I engage him. Now, this phrase in Hebrew has a double meaning. And if you look in my footnote, I give you that double meaning. That's why you have to read the notes when you use my translation. Like a prince puns on, I would declare. Okay? More literally, I would approach him in litigation. But there is a double entendre here because the word for Nagid, a prince, is also a battle commander. The Nagid is the one who stands out in front of the army and commands it in battle. So the double entendre is, I would do battle like a commander. Now, this has a belligerent tone to it. And therefore, we should not be surprised if when God responds to Job, God uh, is affected by the belligerent tone. And so now we will turn, because I want to give it enough time. Some of you, I assume, read my little piece um, uh, in Job's face, facing Job, right, which is two columns, right? One is more about what goes on in the God speeches, and the other is why is it, that people take God's side and not Job's side? These are parallel arguments, and actually, I wrote it out after I was already writing everything on computer. This piece I had to sit down when I thought about it and write on a yellow pad on two sides of the page. That's how they came out more or less, even and more or less the same length, and the arguments are related. But you're not supposed to read across the page, right? The publisher of the book where it appeared neglected to include my directions about how to read it. So I hope you all understood that. If not, well, you might want to read it again. Okay, or not. You just listen. In any case, when God appears to Job, God appears out of the storm wind or the windstorm, which is usually um, uh, 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 translated as the whirlwind, right? Well, as in the King James version. Okay. In any case, the Lord speaks to Job from the windstorm. Now, why is this significant? Because the windstorm is the arena in which ancient Near Eastern storm gods appeared and 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 did their thing. And the storm god in the ancient Near East is always a a militant god, a warrior, right? Who stands. I think I might have shown you this, but if I didn't, I'm sorry because I didn't prepare it as one of the handouts for today to share. But in any case, just look up ancient Near East storm god or the storm god Baal, Canaanite Baal, right? You'll see that there's a famous image of him, which is actually quite a tall relief, and it's in the Louvre, where he's holding a javelin in one hand vertically, and he's holding a club in the other hand, which relates actually to the myth in which the storm god Baal, whose personal name is Hadad in ancient Syria, where he goes to battle against the sea god, whose name is Yam. And this myth, this is just a little footnote, lies behind not only many verses in the Psalms and in the prophets where there's a battle between the deity of ancient Israel and an ancient storm god, or a pagan storm god, or a sea monster who takes on the name of one of the ancient storm god, because this is a story about how the wind, how the pressure of the atmosphere keeps the water that represented by sea from inundating the land. And we say it's a myth, but it is a true story. You just go to the seashore and you can see it very easily. You'll see that the water comes up and then it ebbs, it recedes. Water comes in, water goes out. And we may have our explanations for it, but the mythical explanation for it is that the pressure of the storm god in the atmosphere is pushing the sea back so that it does not inundate the land, which is also why the storm god is the god of rainfall and also the god of the land, the god who protects the land. This myth, believe it or not, lies right behind the story in Genesis chapter 1 about how God makes divisions. And one of the first divisions that God makes is between the water above and the water below, and another between the water and the land, so that the dry land appears. Okay. All right. I'm not going to dwell on that because that's an entire story. Okay, but the point is that that this was a very well known and uh, widespread myth within biblical literature. Now, the storm God appears as a storm god, meaning that God is belligerent, and perhaps he's belligerent in response to Job. And this is how God begins in chapter 38, starting with verse 2. Who is this who obscures good counsel, using words without knowledge? In other words, you're an ignoramus when it comes to me. Verse 3. Bind up your loins like a man. I will ask you, and you help me know. And then God asks Job a whole series of questions that are not meant to be known by ordinary human beings. These are things that God, as the creator of the world, knows, but that Job doesn't know. Where were you when I laid earth's foundations? In other words, you weren't there. Why is that significant? Because if he were there, he would have seen God in action when God created the world. But he wasn't there. So he didn't see God in action, which means he doesn't really know God. I think I spoke about this briefly when we talked about Job's lawsuit against God. In any case, where were you when I laid earth's foundations? Tell me if you truly know wisdom. Who set its dimensions? Do you know? Who stretched the measuring line? Right? This is where God is presenting God's self as a builder, right? The constructor of the world. Into what were its foundations sunk? Who laid its cornerstone, molding the dirt into solid as the clods are stuck together? You'll see that I take that verse from somewhere else. I explain a footnote why I bring it here and why it doesn't belong there, but I'm not going to go into that. When the stars of daybreak sang out and the sons of Elohim cheered, right? That was at the very beginning of creation when there weren't any human beings around yet. And that includes Job. He, God, hedged with double doors Yam as he was gushing out of the womb. That's the sea god. But in mythology, but in biblical poetry, you can cite mythology in the same way that the English Romantic poets love to cite classical mythology in their poems. When I gave him cloud as a garment, rain cloud as his swaddling clothes, it's a beautiful image, and imposed upon him my boundary, setting a bolt across double doors. And of course, it's ironic because this is the same bolt that Job wished were there when he came out of the womb into the world, back in chapter 3, verse 10. And I said, this far you may come, but no more. Here's where I fix the surge of your ways. Have you ever in your days summoned daybreak, made known to the dawning its place, holding the earth by its corners, so the wicked would from it be shaken? Okay, now some people think that because it refers here to the shaking of the wicked off the earth, that this shows that God is really, engaged in justice. That the righteous are on the one hand and the wicked are on the other hand. But if you look through all of the God speeches, this is almost the only reference, and this reference is in a metaphor. And as Carol Newsom and others explain, the metaphor is that imagine the earth is flat. Of course, no one ever imagined that, I suppose. But imagine the earth is flat. And what does God do in the morning? It's like a blanket. God picks up the blanket, just as ancient people who had to lie on a blanket on the ground to go to sleep. They shake the blanket. And in the same way that they had to shake the little bugs off the blanket, God shakes the wicked off the earth. But of course, the wicked are knocked off the earth when? At daybreak. And we know from Job chapter 24 that it's specifically at nighttime that the wicked do their worst, right? For them, day is night, right? The day of the wicked is at night because that's when they can break into your house. That's when they can steal your herds, right? That's when you can't see what they're doing, etc. So to knock the wicked off the earth in at daybreak in the morning simply means that the wicked, right, go run for cover in the morning. It doesn't have anything to do with God trying to make the earth a better, a more just place. All right. The earth is upturned like the clay in a seal. This is a very hard verse in Hebrew. Everybody has trouble with it. I had trouble with it too, but I worked on it as much as I could, and this is the best that I can do. The earth is upturned like the clay in a seal, right? When you put a seal in the clay and you take it off, then you see an image, right, that's standing out. And the wicked stand there like a garment, right? Because a garment is on the outside, you see it. That the wicked be shed of their light. And their light, of course, is the darkness. And the upraised arm be broken. Okay, and he talks about meteorology, about the stars, and does Job know about where the snow is stored and where the rain comes from and everything? We'll talk about that in a minute. He talks about the animals and their mating habits and etc. Um, and then in verse 39, I'll just mention, he says, it's on page 170 at the bottom. Do you hunt down prey for the lion and quell the hunger of beasts as they crouch in their lairs or wait in the thicket to ambush? Who provides rations to ravens when their children cry out to Ale, God, as they wander without food? Okay, now what is the significance of that? Ravens are scavengers and lions are predators. They find their own food. So do ravens. But yet God feels the necessity to provide food for the ravens, right, which is usually carrion, right, dead animals. That's the image here. And God hunts down prey for the lion. Why is this significant? Because the lion is very often in the Bible and in the book of Job, right, a symbol or a metaphor for the wicked. If you look, for example, back in Eliphaz's first discourse, it's on page 20 in my, um, uh, sorry, page 21. No, uh, in my translation, chapter 4, verses 10, 11. The lion growls and the beast roars, but the teeth of the predators finally crack. The lion perishes for lack of prey, and the lion whelps are eradicated. What is this? What is this image mean to Eliphaz? He's trying to say to Job, if you go back uh, to verse 7, think what innocent ever disappeared, and where have the upright been destroyed? What he's trying to say is the wicked, like the lion represents the wicked, they may seem to prosper for a while, but ultimately they're going to be broken. Ultimately, they're going to be broken. They won't be able to provide for themselves or for anybody else. Their children, in this case, right? Now, the metaphor is found in many places, and if you look in my footnote on page 21, 9, you'll see three examples from Psalms, but there are others as well. For example, in chapter 7 of Psalms, uh, starting with verse 2, Adonai Elohai b'cha chasiti hoshieni mikol rodfai v'atzileni. He says, God, please, I trust in you. I take shelter in you. Rescue me from all of my pursuers. And then he says, Pen yitrov ka'aryeh nafshi, lest like a lion he that means my enemy, my pursuer, right? Um, uh, it tears me apart like prey. Porek ve'en matzil, who grabs me, and there's no one to save me from the jaws of the predator. Okay, and there are other. Okay, I have another example marked in my Bible, but time is running out, so I want to stop right there. But my point is, right, that God, if God is trying to present God's self as a good guy, as someone who cares about justice and goodness, why use such examples? In the second of God's discourses, we'll talk about Job's responses shortly, and I'll talk about the first discourse again in a minute. But in the second discourse, God trots out these two scary, semi mythological beasts: the behemoth, who's a cross between some mythological beast and a hippopotamus, and the crocodile, who's again a mix between a mythological serpent and a and an actual animal, the crocodile. And I know that these are semi-mythological because if you read the second discourse carefully, as I point out actually in my commentary in within the translation, you'll see that this is typical of ancient Mesopotamian mythology, that monsters are made, mythological monsters are made of inanimate material, like metal and wood, right? And that's of course these are materials of which these beasts are made. Now, what I want to do is go back to the first of the discourses, chapter 38. We'll start with verse 24. It's on page 169 in my translation. By what path is lightning dispensed, spreading east winds o'er the land? Who cleaves a downpour's channel and a path for the thunderstorm? In other words, God is like it doesn't just rain down, but rains down in a certain direction, right? As though there were a channel or a gutter in which the rain came directly down. To rain down on land without people, on wilderness with no human in it, drenching utter wasteland and sprouting grassy growth. All right, so those who um, make an ecological interpretation of the God speeches say that, you see, God is very concerned with nature just as God is concerned with humans. But I don't see so much where God is concerned with humans. Rather, this is an example by saying that it rains where there aren't any people. It's a direct contradiction to what the Torah promises in Deuteronomy, where it says, right, that if you obey God's commandments, you will get rain in your season, right? It's the large second middle paragraph of the Shema Yisrael, of one of the basic foundations of the Jewish prayer book, which was recited in full twice a day. Okay, so what God is saying is, I make it rain where you can't benefit from it, Job, and all the rest of you human beings. That's at least the way I understand it. I'm not the first person to understand it that way, although most people, don't make as big a deal about it as I do, I admit. Right? The God speeches are complex, and I admit that if you latch on to certain other images and verses from the ones that I emphasize, you can come up with a somewhat different emphasis from the one that I bring. Nevertheless, what I would like to do is to show you something about the rhetoric that God takes here. Does God speak to Job in a compassionate way, in a way that shows respect to a man whom God spoke of at the very beginning of the text in the story that opens it in the prologue? He talks about how Job is like no one else, who is God-fearing and good and turns away from evil and all that. Is this the way you speak to such a person? Okay, so what I would like to do now is to share. Um, and now I have to find something to share. And here it is. Okay, do you see it? You don't see it. We'll try it again. Okay, now I'm doing better. Okay, here we got it. Share. Okay. This is an excerpt in English translation of a very famous Egyptian text, which was loved by a lot of scribes in ancient Egypt, called which modern scholars call a satirical letter. This is just an excerpt. There's an experienced royal official named Hori who responds to a critical letter from a junior scribe named Amenemopet, who happens to be also the name of a scribe responsible or sage responsible for a very famous work of ancient Egyptian wisdom. But I'm not going to talk about that now. Here, this is what the experienced senior scribe writes. Your letter reached me while I was sitting beside the horse, which is in my charge. I rejoiced and was glad and ready to answer. When I went into my stall to look at your letter, I found that it was neither praises nor insults. Your statements mix up this with that. All your words are upside down. They are not connected. In other words, you are completely illogical. You come provided with great mysteries, and you tell me a saying of the sage Hordedef, who's famous, although you know not whether it is good or bad. What chapter is before it? What after? In other words, you don't know the whole text. You don't know what comes before. You don't know what comes after. You, right, are illiterate. Now you are a scribe of experience at the head of his colleagues. Satirical, obviously. The teaching of every book is engraved upon your heart. Your letter abounds in cutting speeches, is loaded with big words. See, you are rewarded with that which was sought, a greater load for you than you have wished. I am ascribed a mahir, which is a West Semitic word, right, like mahir in Hebrew, but it means skilled here. If you're a scribe and you work very quickly, you're mahir. You say again, if there be truth in what you say, come out that you may be tested. You have not gone to the land of Hati. You have not seen the land of Upi, in the Damascus area. Cherem, you know not its nature, nor Yegdi either. On what side of the city of it, that he's talking about a certain river, is the city of Aleppo, the Orontes. Let me tell you of another strange city named Byblos, right on the coast of Lebanon today. What is it like? And its goddess. Who's the goddess of Byblos? Once again, you have not trodden it. Pray instruct me about Beirut, about Sidon and Sarepta, Sarfat in Hebrew. Where is the stream of the Litani? What is Uzu, Old Tyre, like? You are a Mahir experienced in deeds of heroism. A Mahir such as you should be found able to stride at the head of an army. O Marianu, that's a Hurrian term meaning an experienced soldier, like shock troops. Ready to shoot. Okay, so what I'm saying is not that this letter directly influenced the speech of God to Job, but rather that God speaks to Job analogously to the way that this senior scribe, right, um, uh, uh, takes this junior scribe on the carpet. Now, he's talking down to him, right? This is not respectful. What can I say? So, how will Job view God's speeches here? Well, Job doesn't give an entire, right, rundown of the speeches, but this is how he responds. And I want to look a little bit at how he responds. There's a response after the first of God's discourses. There's a response after the second. The reason I think that there are two responses or two God speeches is because there are two there are two um, responses by Job, and the first response has a particular meaning. We're going to look at that right now. All right, where is my share? Okay, this is the Job's response to the first storm, windstorm, whatever. Okay, this is what Job says in chapter 40, verses 4 to 5. Lacking respect, kaloti, which other people think means I am nothing. But doesn't mean necessarily nothing. Um, Kilel in Hebrew is the opposite of kibed, to show honor, to show respect. Lacking respect, which of course is the way that God speaks to Job. How can I answer you? My hand I place over my mouth. And most people think it's Job's way of stifling himself, of saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have spoken this way." That's not what this gesture means. Not in the book of Job and not elsewhere in the Bible. I have spoken once and I will not repeat. I read Eshne here, not in twice, and I will speak no more. Now, what does it mean to put your hand over your mouth? In Job 21:5, he says to his friends, "Face me and be still, and set your hands over your mouths." He's not asking them to take back what they said. He's asking them to be still, to be quiet. Judges 18:19. Men of the tribe of Dan implore a certain Micah to serve, sorry, the T's left out, to serve them as priest, seeing that he's already in possession of all the ritual paraphernalia. Be quiet. Place your hand on your mouth. You see, placing your hand on your mouth goes with being quiet. It's to be quiet, to silence yourself, but not in order to suppress yourself, but to be quiet. He says, be quiet, place your hand on your mouth, and go with us, and be for us a father and a priest. They don't want him to take anything back. He hasn't said anything, really. They want him just to listen and to go with them. In Deuteronomy 27:9, we have Moses and the Israelites are instructed, Haskate and listen. O Israel, today you have become or are becoming a people of the Lord your God. Haskate means to be silent. It's related to sakata in Arabic and sakatu in Akkadian and shatak in Hebrew and sheket as well. It's related. They're all the same etymology, even though the order of the letters is a little different in some cases, and you have the kaf and the tav or the tet are sometimes so-called emphatic. In any case, the Job 29, verses 7 to 9, to me, this is extremely clear. When I would go out to the city gate, says Job, take my seat in the public square, young men would see me and withdraw, and the old would rise and stand. Princes would hold back their words, placing a hand over their mouths. In other words, they would hold back their words. Placing the hand over the mouth means they would be quiet. Leaders would stifle their voices, their tongues clinging to their palates. Okay. And again in Job 29, he says, once I'd spoken, they had nothing to add. My speech fell on them like the rain. They would wait for my rainfall, their mouths open wide to catch it. It's all about the people listening to Job. So what is Job saying? He's saying, I haven't heard an answer to my question. My question to you is, chapter 13 makes it extremely clear, what have I done that's wrong? Tell me what my sins are. Tell me what my transgressions are. And here in God's first speech, he hasn't said a word about it, nor will he in the second speech. And so Job cannot possibly be satisfied. Now, some people think, and there are philosophers, theologians like to think, well, it was enough that God appeared to Job. But that isn't what Job wanted didn't just want an appearance. He didn't want a mystical experience. He wanted an answer to his question. His point is, I should not be afflicted as a punishment. I understand that you, God, are punishing me. I want to know what you're punishing me for. Like a child wants to know from a parent, what's this punishment for? We all would like to know the answer to that kind of question. All right, then after the second speech of God, this is what uh, Job says. And this has been mistranslated by almost everybody. All right, I can't go over my entire explanation here, but I just want to show you that I have gone through this very carefully, more than, if I may say, anybody else that I know or have read, because there are certain phrases here, there's a certain, especially one thing here that no one else, as far as I know, has checked before me. All right, in any case, what Job says is, look, I know you can do everything. I know you're all powerful, right? And then he recites God's speech back to him, right? Who is this who darkens counsel, etc. And Job then says, Al Cain em as, v'nichamti al afar va'efer. Almost everybody translates, therefore I recant and relent. That's the new JPS. Being but dust and ashes. Where's the being but? Al afar va'efer. Al means being but. Show me. The new Revised Standard Version. Therefore I despise myself. All right, that's what recant means. Emas devarai. I can't stand, or I hate my words. Where's the expression? I hate my words. Can you show me somewhere else in the Bible where I hate my words or I reject my words is found? No. Okay. I despise myself. Yes, that could be. But is there a myself here? No, they have to fill it in. They have to fudge. And repent in dust and ashes. Robert Alton. Therefore, do I recant, and I repent in dust and ashes. Here's the thing. In biblical Hebrew, you can't just, if you check all the cases where something is being done in dust and ashes, you need to say standing in dust and ashes, lying in dust and not lying in dust and ashes, or just on the ground, lying in, sitting on, sitting in, standing on, being in. You can't just say vinichamti, let's say whatever that means, repent, which it can mean, in dust and ashes, or on dust and ashes, or over dust and ashes. Well, I say, and what does dust and ashes mean in the Bible? Is it a literal expression? No. It's used two other places in the Bible. In uh, in Genesis 18:27, where Abraham argues about uh, um, whether God should destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, where he says, "I am only dust and ashes." Abraham says to God, "It's a metaphor or a figure of speech meaning lowly humanity." And in Job 30:19, where Job describes the state to which he has deteriorated as dust and ashes, you have thrown me right into dust and ashes. So, and the word venichamti, the verb here, can mean I repent, can mean that. It means I can change my mind, or it can mean, as in Psalm 90, verse 13, Shuva Adonai ad matai v'hinachem alavadecha. Here the JPS translates it correctly. Turn, O Lord, how long? Show mercy or have compassion to your servants, or have compassion on your servants. And in the evening service of Yom Kippur, this is exactly how it is translated. It's used in one of the piyutim, one of the liturgical poems. Tinachem alaf arva efer. May you take pity on dust and ashes. So I say, without filling in anything without fudging, without cheating, without changing a vowel. What it actually means is, therefore, I am fed up. Am us. Now, some people will say, but you need an object for that. No, you don't. Look in Job 7:16. Ma'asti means I am sick of it or I am fed up in my translation. And here the JPS translates it correctly. And many people, many other translations get it correctly there in 7:16. The only reason that the translators want Job to be recanting is because they want him to be recanting. Because later God is going to be approving what Job said and not what his friends said. We talked about this already, right? That God is complimenting Job for speaking truth, and he is blaming the friends for making false accusations of Job and sticking to the conventional pieties. Right? Therefore, I am fed up and I take pity on dust and ashes, which is what it means in the other two places it occurs on lowly, abject humanity. That's what Job says at the end. After hearing you out, I feel sorry for humanity. That's Job's take on the God speeches. All right, now modern scholars, if they're going to be critical of God, they say, well, he doesn't answer, or God doesn't answer Job's questions about what he did wrong. But still, they try to find something good about God's speeches to Job. But what I think Job would take away from this is that God is about power and not about justice and not about divine providence that is taking special care of humanity. Now, in the end of the story, I know Job gets back, double his possessions, and I think now also double his sons and three beautiful daughters, right? More beautiful than any others. And you could say that that is Job's reward in the end, that just as the friends had predicted, Job gets a reward for his righteousness in the end. However, there's another way to look at it, which we mentioned before in an earlier session, which is that at the end of the test, you just set the default settings again. And at the beginning, Job had all these possessions and he had this big family and everything. So why does he get double? Right? Well, we know from the Torah and biblical law is if you steal, if you take something illegitimately, you get it back double. All right. So in any case, that's, I think, what Job would take away from this. What we take away from is something else, right? We can look at it a little differently from the way that Job looks at it. We see a larger picture, and we can perhaps justify to ourselves that God really is about justice and injustice, about reward and punishment. But in this particular case, right, God deviated from God's norm, and in order to test the depth of Job's loyalty and love. Okay, you can say it that way. That's as far as I would go with you anyway. But I don't think that Job would be satisfied because he doesn't get the answers he wants, and he never does. Why that is, right, we all have to think about that. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to allow for some questions or comments. Let's see what we've got in the chat.
Ed, we have one from Myrna at the beginning when you were speaking about the Lion of Judah. How do we understand the Lion of Judah?
Oh, yes. How do we understand the Lion of Judah? Well, the lion is also a very powerful animal and is a symbol of strength. You find it in the oracles of Bilam, and you find it elsewhere, and right, so you have it, and you have it in Jacob's blessings of Judah in Genesis 49. So that's where you get the Lion of Judah. Okay, why do most Hebrew Bible scholars not side with Job? Maybe because the verse that upset the rabbis. Yes, but there are okay. There are some biblical scholars, I have to say, who before I wrote anything about Job had taken um, Job's side. One of these is um, Jack Miles, who wrote this book, God: A Biography. Jack Miles was maybe he still is. I haven't seen him in many years. He was a Catholic priest who left the priesthood and became the literary editor of the LA Times. And he's written other things, but mostly not in the biblical field. But he wrote a very nice book, Job, a biography, where he traces the development of the God idea from the beginning of the Hebrew Bible to the end of the Hebrew Bible. And that's significant because the order of the books in the Hebrew Bible is different from the way the same books appear in the Christian Bible in the Old Testament. So what you see is God's involvement being much greater at the beginning, and then God kind of shrinking in and withdrawing toward the end of the biblical text. Um, Another biblical, one of the leading biblical scholars of our time is a Protestant, sometimes evangelical. He's associated with evangelicals, sometimes a scholar who died not that long ago, and has written a tremendous amount about biblical theology in English, originally in English, named Walter Brueggemann, who was an amazing scholar who could write books like he could write a book, in the time that I could write an essay. But in any case, he was extremely influential. And if you look at his huge theology of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, you will see that he has various approaches. And one of his approaches is that there is a very strong critical approach toward the deity in the Hebrew Bible, and he sees the book of Job in a way that's sympathetic to my reading of the book of Job. Um, I don't mind saying that I was once on a panel of the Society of Biblical Literature where several of us writing commentaries on Job gave samples of our commentary. And after I gave my take, and I was, which included, some theological criticism from the point of view of the book of Job. Again, this is not my personal belief. It is what I think is the belief that's expressed throughout the book of Job by the poet of Job, the author of Job. I saw Brueggemann, who was sitting near the back, gave me two thumbs up. So that was a nice sign. And in any case, that's what I would say. And also the reason that is that most biblical scholars have trouble seeing the end, Job's last words, right, being followed by God complimenting what Job said. But I take it very differently, understanding the theme of the book of Job to be radical, that of truth. So if you ask me, in an earlier version of the book of Job, right, maybe it was the way that most scholars see it. But that's not the book of Job that we have. And I'm interested in what the radical thing that whoever put the book of Job together the way we have it, right, the way that we have this dramatic transition between Job's response to the second speech from the whirlwind or the storm wind or the windstorm and God's speech to Job's friends. Someone else says, what do I make of Job giving an inheritance to the daughters? I think that that's one of the radical things in the book of Job. I think that that is a kind of halachic innovation. And, you can find a little support, very little support for it elsewhere in the Bible, in the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad, which was read in the Torah just this past week. The second part of that. But there, the business, the daughters inherit only if they marry someone within the same tribe and the land stays within the tribe. Here, they inherit, period. And we know that elsewhere in the Persian period, there were women who inherited, for example, at the Jewish colony in Elephantine, And there were women in Babylonia who could inherit, women in Egypt who could inherit too. Okay, here's another comment from Rabbi Rubin. Could Job not getting a direct answer and explanation is a message to us as humans not getting a direct answer? Yes. Okay, except that we have the beginning of the book. So that you could say that there is a tension between the story of Job as it's reflected in the prologue and epilogue and the poetic core of the book of Job, in which God has almost the last word. And you could say that, yeah, there isn't any answer. And that could also be your answer why God doesn't answer Job, that there is innocent suffering and you can't understand it. Unless, of course, you put the prologue together with the core of the book, which is what I do. Okay, Stephen, it seems like, in a sense, Job is simply worn out. While he's not satisfied, he has no choice but to accept God's refusal to provide him with I can't read this here. Wait a second. Uh, uh, something sheet, a
With
charge
a
sheet.
charge sheet.
Charge sheet. We all have questions for God in many areas of life, but we don't get the answers. Yes, okay, I think I've answered that. We talked about that. Can you also remind us about Ruth? Um, I'm not sure. Oh, the women inheriting land and God. Okay, in the book of Ruth, what we have is that I don't think that women in the book of Ruth or Ruth and actually inherit the land exactly, but there's a whole plot involved in the book of Ruth, which I will try to summarize in only a sentence or two, and that is that Ruth Ruth's husband died in Moab. He was a Moabite, and the mother-in-law Naomi, whose husband Elimelech from the town of Bethlehem in Judah, right? He also died. She decides after all the menfolk have died, she's going to go back to Judah, to Bethlehem, and she has a field there that she's going to sell. But she sells this, I think, as an agent of her late husband, because who can buy the field? Only a male relative. A male relative, or at least a male relative, has first dibs on the right first bidding on the field. What happens though is that it's very complicated. I can't go over the whole story, but Ruth goes back with Naomi. She insists. Naomi says, "Don't come back with me. Right? Go back to Moab. There you'll find a husband. You can have a family and everything." But Ruth insists. Why does she insist? Because she loves her husband to death. And she goes back with Naomi, and she knows the only way that she can do something for her husband is to preserve her husband's name on the field that he would have inherited in the town of Bethlehem. So she goes back. She sets it up to marry a wealthy kinsman of her husband, Boaz, who also turns out to be a really nice guy because because what happens is he marries Ruth, and who inherits the field is the son of of Boaz and Ruth. And that son inherits the field, which means that whatever funds or property Boaz put up in order to buy this additional field, they didn't have banks, they didn't have money in the bank. He had to forego some of his property in order to buy this field. So he buys that field, and it is inherited by the son, the legal son of the late Machlon, through what was like a quasi levirate law, if you know what that is. Otherwise, if you don't, look up levirate. Okay. In any case, that's what happens there. So Ruth doesn't inherit the field. Naomi doesn't really inherit the field. The son that's born inherits the field. Otherwise, one of the male kinsmen of Elimelech would have to purchase the field, right? The woman wasn't the owner of the field. Okay. Why up Job? Okay, I'm not sure what that means, Yossi. Can we up?
No, the way you translate Vayan, the word Vayan,
Oh,
Eo, you
up,
don't show
no,
the answers.
up spoke
You
Job
wrote
because it's a because the phrase, in my opinion, right, is a remnant of epic, ancient Canaanite epic. Vayaan doesn't mean to answer; it means to speak up. And so, in order to call attention to the archaicness of it, the strangeness of it, I translate up spoke instead of spoke up. That's why I do that. It was a translator's choice. Yes. Okay. By speaking to the friends and asking them to repeat um, or repent for their sin of dishonesty, God actually reestablishes the truth of being a just God. Isn't this true? You could say that, yes, right? That the friends have to repent of the false things that they said. Yes, the epilogue, right, gives you some justification for seeing God as being just, and you can there is some justice, and but I'm not sure that that isn't just as much a concern that God has, for upholding Job's integrity, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, you can, as I say, the book of Job can be interpreted differently, and especially the speeches of God in the ending of the book can be interpreted differently from the way that I've interpreted. Okay, but I've tried to give you in 4 sessions, right, at least some aspects of Greenstein's reading of Job. Um, I'm going to say thank you to everybody who participated. And I hope that if you thought that these were worthwhile, you should call attention, to these talks. I get nothing from this, I have to say. I'm doing this pro bono, but I'm very happy. I'm doing it for you and in honor of retiring Chancellor Shuli Schwartz of JTS. And you can call attention to the YouTubes that, if they're not up yet, will eventually be up, from what I understand. Okay, I wish you all good health, peace, and I hope that we'll be seeing each other again in happy times and in good places. Shalom. Take care.
Professor Greenstein, on behalf of Schechter Institutes of Jewish Studies, we thank you very much for all of your efforts you put into this course, and we thank everybody for joining us. Yes, the courses are being recorded and will be found on YouTube. You will all get a link, and I thank you very much. Kol Tov, Todah.
Go out to